to the fruit, oh root, to the fruit, woo, to the fruit, oh root, to the fruit, oh root, to the fruit, oh root. Oh, womp bum do my bum bum bum. Got a gal named Sue. She knows just what to do. I got a gal named Sue. She knows just what to do. She vomit to the east, she vomit to the west, but she's the gal that I love best. To the fruit, oh root, to the fruit. Woo.
After World War II, Americans saw an economic boom. Millions of Americans earned more money, which they could spend on homes, cars, vacations, and large appliances. Feeling better than they had during the Depression and World War II, many young Americans were getting married and starting families. The results were boomers. Yeah, boomers have entered world history, but the time period we are talking about, they didn't look like that. They looked more like this. Aww. The significant numbers of babies born gave this new generation the name baby boomers. About 4 million babies were born each year during the 1950s. In all, by the time the boom finally slowed down in 1964, there were, and still are, almost 77 million baby boomers, including my parents. With all these babies, there was a rising demand for homes, and that sparked the development of new suburban neighborhoods, building houses outside the cities to give new families a new life. Cities were on the decline. New York loses about 2 million people over this period. Houses were built before, but never on this scale. Levittown sprang up out of nowhere. Levittown was a company that built houses almost as fast as the babies were being born. It was like the Ford production line of houses. 60% of Americans now own their own home. And with the invention of air conditioning, more and more Americans were moving to the southern states than moved out during the Civil War. There was this feeling that the country had regained prosperity. Fast food restaurants popped up all over the place, and it quickly became a sensation. A new restaurant called McDonald's sold burgers for 15 cents, about half of what a burger cost at a regular diner at the time. Americans became hooked, not only on fast food, but on television. Television struggled to become popular at first. It started with only 3 networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC. By the end of the decade, that rose to 530 stations. Shows like The Lone Ranger, I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver hit the airwaves. You might have no idea what those shows were, so I will just say it was similar to episode 1 of WandaVision. New styles of music ushered in the rock and roll revolution. The coming of rock and roll in the mid-50s was not merely a musical revolution, but a social and generational upheaval on a vast and unpredictable level. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was labeled a menace to morals by the older generation. The generation of young teenagers collectively rebelled against the music their parents loved. In general, the older generation loathed rock and roll. They were appalled by the new styles of dance movements of shaking their hips, and the churches proclaimed it to be Satan's music. But this generation of youth was much larger than any in recent memory, and the prosperity of the era gave them money to spend on records and phonographs, and by the end of the decade, the phenomenon of rock and roll helped define the difference between youth and adulthood. Now, not everyone during the 1950s was living the American dream. Though men and women had been forced into new employment patterns during World War II, once the war was over, traditional roles were reaffirmed. So working women were looked down upon. Being a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary were the only acceptable employment, and there was always the pressure to get married. Progress for African Americans also took a hit after the war. The struggle is described in Ralph Ellison's book, The Invisible Man, the story of a young college-educated black man struggling to survive and succeed in a racially divided society that refuses to see him as a human being. Yet it's going to be different this time. This new generation will not accept going back to the before World War II social structure so easily. The 50s will kick off the civil rights movement. The baby boomers generation will stand up for one another and demand equality, something the generations before them failed to do.
Walked through a party in the county jail. The prison man was there, they began to wail. The band was jumping and the joint began to swing. You should have heard the knockback jailbird singing, let's rock. Everybody, let's rock. Everybody in the whole cell block, they was dancing to the jailhouse rock. Spider Murphy played a tenor saxophone. A little Joe was blowing on the side trombone. The drummer boy was milling over crash boom bang. The whole rhythm section was a perfect